It's absolutely joyous to be here on Sky. Your brother ended up on a Greek island. You've ended up on a Hebridean island. Who do you think won?
Oh, my brother. He was a sensible one. I should have made that decision a long time ago.
Well, why? I mean, it's extraordinary as a place. It feels like you're at the end of the world. You could have ended up anywhere. Metropolis in Oxford or wherever. Why?
I don't think I'd ever have ended up living in a city. I find it very important to be close to a wild and natural scene. And my brother and I share a lot. And when we were young, we said there are two great places to live, and one of them's the Scottish Islands, and the other is the Greek Islands. And he's ended up on the Greek Islands, and I've ended up in the Scottish Islands.
You can live vicariously through one another.
Yes.
So I came to see you 8 years ago or so, for the same project where I'd speak to influential and compelling thinkers about a question that they think we should be asking ourselves. The question you offered then was, what is my culture preventing me from seeing? Since then, you've written a massive tome, which I have here, The Matter with Things. You've produced a huge amount. Is that still the question that you think we do well to start kind of considering a bit more closely?
I think it's a very important question, no doubt. Because if you don't know what it is that's missing from your life, you won't know how to lead your life so as to rediscover the things that you no longer see. Mm-hmm. So not knowing what it is you don't know is the fatal problem. Not knowing is fine, but knowing that you don't know is a very good position, and exploring that. But in our culture, we're encouraged to think that increasingly we know it all, that we've got it all worked out, and we're organizing life according to lines that we have set up. And we're not aware of what it is that's gone missing. I think people of my age, I'm 71, see things having disappeared from life during their lifetime. And I don't know quite how young people would know that these things were missing, really, unless we were able to discuss them and open eyes to them.
So I wonder if we could begin by talking about what you mean by seeing. Attention is a moral act, is that shorthand for much of your work? When you talk about what we're seeing, are you talking about what we're paying attention to?
I am. I'm not talking about visual sight. I'm talking about the things that we recognize and understand. And though sight is a very important and powerful sense with which we get to know things in the world, it's not really what I'm talking about.
So what is it, I suppose, what is it that you think we are seeing and not seeing? Like, what are we paying attention to the exclusion of other things? What would be examples of that at the moment?
Well, I think that we've been led to adopt and become enslaved by a certain way of looking at the world, which is mechanistic and reductionist. And with that, a sense of values, a sense of purpose, a sense of there being something wonderful, awe-inspiring, and perhaps sacred in the world has gone missing. It's not just my impression, but research shows that a very large majority of young people, over 80%, think that their life is meaningless. It may be that we've developed all kinds of gadgetry and technology, but nothing can really replace the sense of meaning by sheer material wherewithal. So we value what the left hemisphere values. The left hemisphere is essentially in the service of utility. The reason we have two hemispheres, and it's not just us, but all the creatures that we know that have brains have two hemispheres. And the difference is that they pay attention to the world in different ways. And the left hemisphere's attention is in the service of utility. It's a very narrowly targeted attention to something that's already known to be of value, and it goes and gets it. Now, that is essentially how we look. What do we need? What would we like? What would make us more powerful? Let's go for it and get it. But the right hemisphere is seeing the whole picture. It has sustained, broad, vigilant attention to the whole. And it therefore sustains our sense of a whole to which we belong and where our position has meaning. But we've decontextualized everything. We now don't understand that a thing is not just a thing. It changes its nature depending on the context that it's in. When we take it out of the context in which it belongs and from which it derives its meaning, it no longer seems to have any meaning. So the trouble with this world picture is it sees meaningless items whose only possible value can come from ways in which we can use them. And this has largely dominated, certainly in certain sectors, the way in which people now think of the natural world as a heap of resource which we can mine and use and exploit for effectively utilitarian purposes. But the kind of attention that the right hemisphere is able to give sees a living web of interrelationships. So it sees that nothing is just what it is outside of a context, but always is what it is because of the relations in which it stands to everything else. And indeed, in the matter of things, I argue that relations are primary. They come before the things that are said to be related. So they actually emerge out of a web of meaning, and that meaning is often implicit, whereas the left hemisphere doesn't understand what's not made explicit. This is also a facet of our culture, that things have to be spelt out in language that, as it were, a machine could understand. But in fact, almost everything that matters to us can't be subjected in this way to a translation or a degradation into everyday language. When you explain a poem, you've somehow destroyed it. Although it's perfectly legitimate to pay that kind of attention to it for a while, but unless you embrace the whole with the new information, then you've lost something important. But not just poetry, but obviously all the arts, music, painting and architecture, but also ritual, myth, narrative, the ways in which we come to understand our place in the cosmos, which have always been very important, usually also involved with a story of the cosmos, a story about the superhuman, in other words, again, the sacred realm. And I think all of this we lack to a large extent now. People are hungry for it, and when I speak to them about what has happened and show them, they immediately understand what's missing. But they often say things like, until I read you or until I heard you, I wasn't really aware of how much was missing from my world.
You say that never has humanity known so much but understood so little in your book. Could you unpack what you mean then by understanding?
Yes, absolutely. I think I would make a distinction between information, knowledge, which has different kinds, and understanding, and above all, wisdom. Information is the collection of points of data, effectively. And obviously on its own, until somebody makes sense of it, it's not telling us anything. That's where the idea that we're beginning to know something comes in. And knowing can have two importantly different meanings, which carry with them different verbs in Latin, Greek, and German, for example. But in English, we're saddled with the word know. And I say I know that Paris is the capital of France. That is the kind of knowledge the Germans call Wissen, and it's French savoir. You know the facts, as it were. But I can say I know Paris because I spent 2 years living there and I'm familiar with it. And that is a different kind of knowing. Now, in the sense of understanding, it's that second sense of comprendre or kennen in German. the knowing by acquaintance, experiential connection, immersed in it, in all its complexity, that gives us knowledge. Now, understanding is taking it a further step. And understanding is the equivalent of intelligence. And one of my worries is that in calling whatever artificial mechanisms we create intelligent, we are denying something very important about the human, indeed animal mind, which is that it creates wholes which are built up from experience of something that has flesh and blood, that has emotions, that has an innate moral sense, not something that's been fed into it by a clever chap in California, but actually intelligence. And intelligence, again, there are different words in different languages, but our word intelligence comes from Latin roots, inter, legere, to read between. And that brings on straight to my idea that, in fact, what we are looking at always is relations, that it is not the things that create the world, but the relations between them, out of which they come into being, that is important. Everything is relational, primary. And it's only secondary it becomes non-relational when whatever it is we focused on has been abstracted from its context. So being able to see the betweens of everything is really special and important. And also what I like is interlegere. Also means sort of reading between the lines, if you like. So in poetry, I usually take an example of Hardy's astonishing body of poetry that he wrote in 1912 to 13 after his wife's death. And the poems are unique and powerful. But if you ask me what are they about, I say, well, they're about how painful it is when somebody you love dies. Sort of completely collapsed the meaning, the depth of meaning. And that's another thing that matters, is that, if you like, information is two-dimensional, if that, probably only one-dimensional. Knowledge begins to get, especially with the experiential kind of knowledge, to have depth. And intelligence is when we can see into the depths of a larger picture and put it together in a way that means something. But surprisingly, this is very like the way in which the hemispheres do in fact relate to one another and should do correctly. So the right hemisphere, we know, takes the first take on a new experience. So this has been laid out by various neuroscientists, that when we have a new experience in whatever modality, the right hemisphere is alert to it. And then almost instantly, it's taken up by the left hemisphere and categorized. And so it no longer becomes that particular experience in all its specialness and richness, but an exemplar of something.
A map, not the territory.
So effectively, it's building a map. It's building a schema, a diagram. And that's fine, but that information, there's nothing wrong with a map, but it needs to be applied to a real world, not mistaken for the real world. And the difficulty at the moment is that we're beginning to mistake the map for the experiential world. So we live in this very thin, theoretical version of life in which everything has been decontextualized. It's lost its life. And literally, another interesting difference between the hemispheres is the capacity to see things as animate in the right hemisphere and the tendency to see them as inanimate in the left hemisphere.
You write at the end of Matter of Things in your epilogue about the meaning crisis, which you mentioned, and the lack of belonging we have because we are disconnected from nature, disconnected from one another, and disconnected from the divine, which now seems like superstition and nature, bank of resources. How can you connect the dots there between this kind of flattened, devitalized view of the world and the fact that we've become so disconnected from it?
Absolutely. You say the word belong there, and of course that suggests a sense of a milieu, be it a family, be it nature, or be it the divine cosmos, in which we play a part, out of which we came, so we're derived from it. We're not external to it, which is why I reject the word environment, suggesting something just around us. It's in us and we are in it. And so in each of these cases, we are what we are because of the set of relationships we would ideally have with a society of people that we can trust, who share our values, and with whom we can eat, pray, lead our lives. In the case of nature, the very strong bond that one feels, which in me is a sort of instinctual longing to be in the presence of the wildness and of the natural scene. I think we all have that feeling in us, or most of us, and that until a couple of 100 years ago, almost everybody in the world would have been living anyway in a natural setting too. And the third is this business of belonging, in the sense of knowing that there's something beyond us, that is greater than us. And if you want, you can stop there and just say there is something higher than us. It would be irrational, actually, to suppose that there wasn't. It only knows what it is it knows. It doesn't know what it doesn't know. So obviously it thinks it knows everything, because that follows. So it's bound to be missing anything else than what it can rationalize. And the difficulty there is that we are evolving beings. You know, what makes us think that at this point in the evolution we finally can understand everything? As I sometimes say, a mouse might think that, you know, but we know more than the mouse. Maybe the mouse probably knows more than we do in some areas, but we are missing something important. I just want to say that in talking about those, I mentioned that there's a sort of deep yearning for, and I want to mention that belonging comes from an Anglo-Saxon root, langian, to stretch. And I talk about this more in the Master and his Hemisphere, but the idea is that there is a connection between things that can be stretched apart up to a point, but they feel the need of the tension in that relationship, and so they long across the length of the connection for one another. So belonging is a very, very important point.
And this presumably is some measure of explanation for the epidemic of loneliness, of kind of the mental health crisis. This is the fruits of a left hemisphere view of the world.
Oh, absolutely so, yes. I mean, because the left hemisphere does isolate things and sees them only in abstract, and is frankly not emotionally very intelligent. It's actually not cognitively that intelligent either. I was surprised when researching the matter of things to discover that the right hemisphere is not only very obviously much more emotionally and socially intelligent, but actually more important for cognitive intelligence, in other words, for IQ. So the left hemisphere has done a good job on projecting itself as the one that knows and the one that understands, but it's relatively stupid. And you know, in psychology, there's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which means that the less you know, the more you think you know it all.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier values and purpose, which you've got chapters on, really small books on in the matter of things. The way we pay attention is shaped to some degree by what we value, and the values of the left are different from the values of the right. You speak about Max Scheler and his hierarchy of values with, you know, the holy and the good and the true and beautiful at the top, and then at the bottom, the instrumental and the pleasurable. I guess if we're valuing things wrongly and therefore attending to things wrongly, what are the mechanisms by which that can be corrected? I was speaking earlier in this podcast season to Dr. Keltner, who studies awe, and he says experiencing awe seems to realign your values. It often makes you feel much more connected to one another, to nature, to the divine. But could you say a little bit about when people have their values realigned in a way that reflects the right hemisphere more? What are those experiences that lead to that? Does that make sense as a question?
Well, I think, again, beginning from the sense that we don't know it all is a very good place to start. I think the key feature of the way we think now is that it is hubristic. In other words, it exemplifies an arrogant, overbearing sense that we know far more than we do. And it not only is that destructive of value and meaning, but it's also really not very intelligent. And so if one can rekindle the sense of awe before things that are beautiful, before things and people that are genuinely good, and things that speak to us and therefore have a kind of truthfulness in the connection with us, then we can begin to see a world that has much more meaning in it. But currently, beauty is curiously being neglected by almost everything, including art. A lot of modern art is the creator does not wish to be told that it's beautiful. They wish to be told that it's powerful. And power, of course, is the only value recognized by the left hemisphere. But as Dostoevsky said, it's beauty that will save the world. I puzzled over that for a long time because, of course, a sense of aesthetic value can lead one to be deceived. But then making wrong judgments about what's good and true can also lead you to be deceived. But I think what he was getting at is that when we have really lost our bearings on truth and what is meant by goodness, so that now truth is whatever my truth is, we make it up, and there's no sense of it being, despite the fact that we, of course, I acknowledge and talk about this a lot, that we go to make parts of everything we experience. That doesn't mean that we just make it up, and it doesn't mean that some things are not truer than others, even though there may not be one single absolute truth. Goodness has been reduced to the following of a lot of rather mindless rules and ticking boxes for having expressed certain values or positions. And that, of course, has nothing really to do with goodness. But the one thing that can speak to us directly is beauty. And so in that state where we've been abandoned by and felt lost by no particular bearings on goodness and truth, beauty can still call to us. So I think all those three values, and they are, in my view, contributors to the sense of the sacred. They're facets of the sacred. Regaining that in our world, I think, is important. I'm not saying that everybody must suddenly start going to church or whatever. That's not my point. And I'm rather opposed to people who think that it's all in a book, whether that be a Christian book or a Muslim book or whatever. It's about a disposition of one's spirit, one's soul, towards the world. And what kind of a disposition is that? It's one in which there is room for awe and wonder, which helps us to see not that we're useless or meaningless, but curiously that we have meaning and value, because we're connected to something that is awe-inspiring, that we know is bigger than us, but nonetheless, we're not humbled in the negative sense that we're made to feel small, but we derive richness from that relationship. I think that's one thing. Another would be the sense of compassion for things, and I think that's an important thing that's gone missing in our culture of anger, narcissistic rage, the hubristic belief that we're right and you must be wrong, and so on. And a degree of modesty, basically. So I think those features, if we started adopting a more wondered, more modest, and more compassionate view towards others, towards the world, I think a lot of our problems will begin to heal themselves. But as you know, in this world where people no longer feel there is any meaning or connection, mental illness is at colossal heights. And most people think of themselves as basically lonely. And why? Because we have destroyed all the contexts in which people used to find their being and belonging.
This idea that we're prevented from seeing these things, which has come through, to some extent, technology. Like technology is our ability to manipulate the world. You might also say that we are kind of educated into it. We're given a value system. So as someone who's personally invested and interested in education, I wonder what the principles might be of an education, if education is the way we create our own future, like of what kind of priorities and principles should it try and move forward?
Well, it's very difficult to recapture things in an educational system, although an educational system can be very valuable and important, obviously, and I believe my own education was profoundly important in shaping me. But I think we have to revalidate the importance of the family, that the way in which you think about the world, the things that you hold to be good and right, are part of what your family inculcates in you, by example, and sometimes by precept. As to schools, I think the first thing I'd say, because a lot of people imagine that the right hemisphere is a bit sort of let it all hang out. This is sort of a hippie hemisphere. And that's how it was projected in the bad old days, when we used to say things like the left hemisphere is rational and verbal and the right hemisphere does pictures and just gets emotional. And the important point for here is that the right hemisphere is not only much better at feeling really the deep emotions rather than superficial social emotions. The ones preferred by the left hemisphere: anger, scorn, derision, a sense of self-pride. These are different from the deep emotions of togetherness, of sympathy, empathy, and so forth. But the right hemisphere is also the hemisphere of control of inappropriate or excessive emotion, which people perhaps didn't expect. And what I'm leading to here is that I don't think that education should just be a matter of do your own thing and let it all hang out. I think it's very important that there should be discipline. And discipline is now a sort of dirty word, but actually the loss of self-discipline in our world, which has been eroded very badly in the last 50 years, with praise of self-indulgence, self-promotion, and so forth, over self-discipline, this will lead to tyranny. Because if we don't discipline ourselves, then there's a need for external constraints on everything. And so you see an explosion of rules and algorithms and principles and handbooks and so on, which none of which should be necessary if people have any sensitivity to what is required of them through a morally cohesive society. So I think the sense that it's not all about us, it is about a society that we build, to be proud of a society and its values in as much as one recognizes what they are and agrees with them. But above all, to know more about humanities. I mean, the key is in the word. Without the humanities, we don't really understand human beings. So it's very well to promote STEM subjects, which are the technical subjects, and I'm not saying they're not important at all. But like the left hemisphere not being unimportant, it's very important, it nonetheless needs to be set within a context of what the right hemisphere knows. And so all that technical information is only good if it's set in the context of a broader understanding of what human beings are and where we're going with our lives and with our society. And that will come from studying literature, history, music, drama. These things are not just add-ons, These are the core, in my view. And in the old days, it used to begin with a thorough knowledge of Western civilization, beginning with the Greeks and the Romans and working forward. I expect nowadays somebody will say that that's exclusive or something, but I think it's extremely important. If you want to completely demoralize a people, tyrants have known this, destroy their history, cut them off from their history, and they will lose any will to defend themselves or anything else because they can't see any point anymore. So we really do need to stop being silly about this and accept that we are depriving young people of something very, very important unless we give them a proper grounding in their own culture. And that's not to say that it shouldn't include admiration for things that come from other cultures, emphasize the importance of Eastern values against those of the West. And it's only more recently that I realized that it's really important now, with people taking, sledgehammers and pneumatic drills through Western culture, to say, hang on, this is something completely amazing that we created. And you're using the freedom that it created, almost uniquely in the history of mankind, to destroy it. You have that liberty because of the very culture that you're against. So something absurd is happening in education now, and it involves reintroduce what is required to go on being educated, quote educated, up to university level. Some people will benefit from university, and I'm sorry, some people won't. And when everybody has to go to university, then the universities themselves become less good places to learn in. I know this is all very unpopular, but it seems to me common sense, actually. And that a lot of people don't want to be in school after a certain age. They become disruptive, particularly boys, and that maybe the thing is to allow them to leave. And if they want to later, I think that the university should be a choice we make later, when we've had a little bit of experience of life. And then if you really want to go to university, if you have a burning desire to know more about whatever, good, go for it. And that will make a better society and better universities to produce people that will make a better society.
Size-wise, I resonate with that. Something you alluded to, I've written at length about, is purpose. And a sense that we maybe have reduced purpose to something extrinsic. Lots of the most valuable stuff in life is intrinsically purposeful. I think you observe that we aim at happiness now more than ever, but we're measurably less happy. We aim at freedom and autonomy, but we're bound by restrictions and so on. Those are kind of extrinsic purposes. How do you know what to aim at? Is that like...
Well, obviously, in some ways, this brings us to values again.
Yes.
I see values as things that call to us from ahead. They may not be entirely resolved in the sense of brought into sharp focus for us, but they are entities that speak to us, that call to us. That is how I've experienced them. One is drawn forwards towards the good, the beautiful, the true. Now, most of our images come from machines, and there's nothing more harmful than one can do than to try and approximate a human life to that of a machine, the functioning of a machine. So they are things that guide where we want to go from in front, whereas a machine is pushed from behind. A machine has no sense of direction. It's made to go in certain ways. When it comes to talking about purpose, it's terribly important to distinguish between two kinds of purposes, and you did really allude to that when you said intrinsic, because machines have extrinsic purpose. In other words, the machine itself is not aware of a purpose. The machine is simply carrying out a purpose of the human being that made it. However, not everything has this utilitarian nature and is valued for it, and obvious examples are music and dance. These things are not valuable because they lead to us doing certain things. They are valuable because they have intrinsic meaning and value that speaks to us. They acquaint us with something that is beautiful and speaks to us. And that's what I mean by an intrinsic purpose. James Cass, the philosopher, made a distinction between games that are infinite and games that are finite. So an example of an infinite game would be something like music, which doesn't reach a goal and then stop, but can be carried on for as long as people want to do it because its purpose is in itself. Finite games are done as a football game is, so that we want an outcome, and at a certain 90 minutes we have it, and one team has won or the other, whatever. So that is a kind of distinction. And I suppose that what I'm very keen not to suggest is that if I say that I believe there is purpose in the cosmos, and I think it's there, that Irene is put there by an engineering god. So when you look at the cosmos, even the inanimate cosmos at large, or what we think is inanimate anyway, we see something that is constantly evolving, changing, towards complexity and a kind of beauty. And there are drives, even in the world. Inanimate structures have tendencies to go in certain directions. When it comes to life, much more so. So that's an important thing to realize, that there is a kind of direction. But it's not something that has been written in advance by the cosmos or by the ground of being or by God, whatever you want to call it. That doesn't mean to say it has no purpose. It has a direction towards certain values, and the details, as it were, are absolutely open. So we're not, I believe, programmed to do every single thing we do. I just don't believe that anyone now could possibly defend Laplace's 18th century vision that if you knew the position and momentum of every particle in the universe at a certain point, you wouldn't be able to unpack the whole of the rest of history. And surely modern physics already tells us that such certainty is not available. And that doesn't mean to say that the only alternative is pure chaos. There is something very important in the dipole of order and disorder. And that the important thing is that there should be both present. Without a bit of disorder, the thing is dead and will sclerose and fossilize. It's that element of potential for change that is so important in everything, and not just in the living world, but perhaps particularly obviously in the living world. And equally, of course, if there was only disorder and randomness, nothing would have any directional meaning. So I believe that we are and exemplify something that is purposeful, but does not mean that, well, I have no choice. I play a part. And maybe I could expand on this a little.
Yeah.
Because the really fascinating thing is, why should it be life? Why should it be life at all? It's a very expensive business, life. It uses a great deal of energy, causes a lot of suffering, and it has to kick against the second law of thermodynamics, against the increase in entropy that suggests, because we're all the time moving against that trend. How could this have come about? And I think first thing said about it is that to get over a phase in the process that would always stop any further progress because it was in itself disadvantageous, there has to be an ability for whatever it is to have a sense of something beyond. A very good point made by Bruce Charlton is that, a simple one really, but an important one. Why did sexual reproduction take hold? I mean, originally organisms existed by parthenogenesis. In other words, they divided and that was it. But the idea of having to find a suitable mate and only producing, when you reproduce, smaller numbers than you would get from being able to divide yourself, means that you're perpetually, in that early phase, at a disadvantage in terms of competition. You're trying to do something that is uphill. And yet, nonetheless, somehow this has been brought into play, and we carry on with that system. But another important point is that life gives us the capacity to respond to something beyond. Now that sounds a bit grand and vague, but let me unpack it a bit. Inanimate things do respond to another inanimate thing. Over periods of millions of years, rocks get formed and move and change and so on. But their ability to respond to things is very limited. So what is special about life that makes it worthwhile? I think it is actually the ability to respond to the values that are in the nature of the ground of being, which are goodness, beauty, and truth, primarily. And maybe other things, but those are the key elements of beings that can respond to them and therefore resonate with them and help them fulfill themselves and help further them. or alternatively choose to ignore them. We are free agents. But I think that is why there is life. Otherwise, it's a great puzzle. As Iain Whitehead said, there is very little survival in being alive. You last for a few years. But if you are inanimate, you can persist for a very long time. So it can't be to do with creating creatures that are better and better at surviving, because life itself is not a very good system for surviving. And the most ancient creatures, some examples of certain actinobacteria in the depths of the ocean, are individual examples of them are 1 million years old. So everything that's happened since in evolution has been generally towards things becoming shorter lived. So how does one defend the difficulty of creating life, the problem with getting over the hump of entropy, and the purpose, if you like? And I think that purpose is to be in the dynamic partnership of cosmos and creation. Whitehead himself thought this, that the ground of being was ever more coming into being through, as it were, the dance of evolution with what it was bringing into being.
So is that baked into evolution? Evolution is the algorithm that kind of explains developing towards complexity and life, but you think baked into that is this ability to discern the beautiful and true.
Yes, I do think so. And I think another point that's relevant here is that until very recently we believed that evolution could only work by making billions and billions of false attempts until one happened by chance to turn out to be helpful. But a single cell can be faced with an assault for which it is not programmed by evolution, nor has experience in its own lifetime, if you like to put it that way. It can make a change within a period of only a few days that, if it had to happen by trial and error, would take perhaps literally billions of years. So there is built into these adaptive changes is something that allows us to make changes much faster than a kind of blind throwing of the cards up in the air and hoping that the one that you want will land in your hand. That it seems to be no longer a defensible position. I don't know why this is, but it is the case. Anyway, one has to take that into account. So interesting, how does that happen? I don't know. But I think there are shapes, patterns, if you like, that draw things towards themselves. And in fact, since we accomplished that wonderful feat of decoding the human genome, we've been made to realize how little information there is in the human genome. Nowhere near enough to deal with what a growing organism is faced with. And so there must be something else that allows forms in three-dimensional shapes to be expressed that can't be expressed in the only 2% of DNA that actually gives instructional information. So where is that? And I think that people are beginning to see that there must be electromagnetic fields or fields of some kind that physics would recognize that contains information of a gestalt, of a form that something is moving towards. We see this in the evolution of creatures. If you interfere with their development, they will try to steer back to something. If you chop off the head of a nematode worm, it will regrow its head. And it will also, the new head will have the knowledge that the old head had, even though that head has been incinerated. So where does it come from? When you cut off the antlers of a deer, every deer's antlers has a particular pattern, and it will produce the same pattern exactly that it had before, not just a random pattern. But where is that three-dimensional pattern stored? I don't have the answer to that.
What fascinating examples. You made me think of, I think it's Stanley Cumley Morris, the paleozoologist, who says that you point out that your evolution as an algorithm is very effective at describing things, but it doesn't describe something like music, where whales have song cultures, birds have counterpoint, melody and harmony, and so on. So it's more like mathematics, something you discover, and it's beautiful. And it brings to mind this idea that we're growing towards the good and the beautiful and the true, that it's part of the fabric of the universe.
Yes. I mean, quite how it works is not something I claim to understand, but I don't think that that's a reason for trying to conceal or deny things that are matters of observation. So there's something there that is shaping the course, the form, the nature of whatever it is that is coming into being.
May I ask you about those people who probably sound somewhere significantly different to you, who think the world is making good progress? If you think of the late Hans Rosling or Steven Pinker, who would say that actually we use our hard data on longevity or literacy or healthcare. What we're doing is truly moving in the right direction. It seems like he would like to say, we're absolutely not moving in the right direction. We need to back up and figure out where we've lost our way. What's your, I know you've actually corresponded a bit with Steven Pinker, but what's your response to the people who say we're making good progress and this is the right direction?
Well, I think probably, once again, it's a difference between, that can be illustrated by the difference between the hemispheres. So the left hemisphere would want to say that something was good by ticking certain boxes that it's beforehand decided are going to be important. So it finds, for example, that more people now earn a wage than in the past it did. So it says we're making progress. And one of the things I'd like to say about that is that the reason that there are more people who earn wages is that there has been massive erosion and destruction of the environment and ways of life of indigenous people who have been more or less forced to go to cities to try and get jobs, where of course they do get a pittance, but they are for the first time truly poor. We know that levels of human flourishing, in other words, a sense of well-being, a sense of belonging, a sense of happiness, a sense of fulfillment, these things are much higher in pre-modern Western societies than they are in such societies. And as people move into such societies, as unfortunately they do all the time, they become progressively more unhappy. One of the fascinating findings is that poor Mexicans who move to America, in the first generation of those who go there, their rates of mental illness are relatively low compared with the Native American population. But in the next generation, they become considerably higher. And in the generation after that, they approximate to the levels of misery that are typical of the US population. Now, it seems to me that you can only argue that this is a better society by casuistry. And saying, well, it reminds me very much of something that when I told the professor of psychiatry at the Maudsley when I was a relatively junior doctor, that research showed that people were less happy now than they were in the 50s, and they are staggeringly less happy. He said, but that can't be right. They've all got washing machines. And he was a delightful man, but a little bit on the autistic spectrum, I suspect. But this business of deciding that it must be better because this is something that this society considers important. Of course, one of the things about washing machines alone is that it's not for me to say. I've never had to go and scrub clothes in a communal area in a village, but apparently people who now have a tub at home are more isolated and more lonely because they don't have to go and meet the other women in the marketplace who are washing clothes. And so we don't know what it is that builds community in a culture.
Yeah, it brings to mind Marshall McLuhan said with each new piece of technology, you say what's extend. So the washing machine extends your time is not spent doing it. But when it's overextended, what does it amputate? That community that comes from being in the wash house, or the phone has stopped us needing to go and visit people and so on. And in the process of progress, we have these amputations that are sometimes dehumanizing.
Yes,
and
yes.
kind of destructive to community.
Yes, and I'm going to get it in the neck for saying this, but never mind. I worked in a very poor part of South London for the Maudsley Hospital, and my catchment area was very multicultural, multi-ethnic. And so when seeing a new patient, I would take a detailed history, and part of that history would be to ask them about their experience in their upbringing and so forth. And it was noticeable that among the black population, that those who had come over in, say, the 50s and 60s, I would say to them, did you experience a lot of racism? And I'm not denying that there was racism, but I'm just telling you what I found. They would say, no, not really. No, I mean, we had a way of sort of joshing with one another, but it wasn't unpleasant. But if I asked their grandchildren who would come to see me wearing expensive trainers and Ray-Ban glasses and so on, did they experience a kind of racial prejudice? They would say, oh, absolutely they did. And so it can't be denied that there's a matter of perception. And if you tell people that they're victims, they will feel their victimhood. That actually will also disempower them and make them unhappy. It's a difficult one because, of course, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't do what we can to limit truly unpleasant and indeed criminal racism, which is disgusting, and I hope and believe that it has in fact been diminished. I know that when I was growing up and I talked to my friends, we had black and Indian friends, and actually it never occurred to us that somehow they were different. I mean, it just wasn't the thing we thought about. And so it never occurred to us to exclude them. But, you know, I'll just be an example of some terrible old fogey who doesn't really understand and get what it is that they're experiencing. But I just want to problematize that vision that things are just getting worse for those people and say, well, in some ways, I can't help thinking that they must be somewhat better than they were.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting observation, and I think helpful in some ways. I was listening to someone, I can't remember her name, speak the other day about the fact that we lose agency when we can chalk our behaviour up to some previous trauma or whatever label we want to give ourselves. Oh, well, I'm behaving like this in this way, and that loss of agency removes what psychologists call an internal locus of control.
Absolutely,
and robs us of a sense of meaning in our life.
Yes,
I think.
It infantilizes, basically. It says, you have no power here. The power is all external, as you're saying, the loss of the internal focus of control, locus of control. And that's never good for people and stops them being able to move on because they nurse a grudge, what can allay it? Because if it was allayed, they'd then have to say, well, maybe I do play some part, I do bear some responsibility for my situation. Now, I think anyone who thinks they don't bear any part in their situation is deluded.
I mean, it feels like a tightrope to speak about this, doesn't it? But
I know.
But I feel like you're very much onto something. People are growing up more slowly, taking responsibility more slowly. And, COVID had something to do with that. There's various things in our culture which, as you say, infantilize us and remove agency. And then you can draw a pretty straight line from that to a sense of meaninglessness.
Yes, absolutely. Because a lot of meaning comes from the responsibilities one takes on oneself to work, to be a good neighbour, to be a responsible member of society, all these things. If you just chuck them all, what are you left with?
One of the things that strikes me about your work is that you are taken in by people who have pretty different worldviews and treatments. So they might be fairly Eastern, fairly Christian, or not religious at all. And to some extent, they go flat on you and say, Iain, he's like, what he's saying is something we resonate with. So if you have a Venn diagram of these different perspectives with you in the middle, what is it that you think you're putting your finger on that they all resonate with?
I think that what a lot of people say when they write to me, God bless them, saying that my writing has changed their lives or even saved their lives and so on, which is a remarkable and wonderful thing. The common thing they say is there was a lot of this that I knew at some level and I understood at some level, but had no words to express. And what you've done is to enable me to see why believing those things and knowing those things is important. And so I think what I've done is to bring things that are very hard to express, and there are pitfalls and traps everywhere in trying to express them, to a point where people can read them and get them, even if they don't begin from a standpoint of understanding what it is I'm trying to unfold. So I see my work as it were taking people on a journey to say, look at this, and let's have a look at this, and then leading them to a position where their view of the world is quite different than the one they started off with. And they're not forced to accept it, of course. I'm sure some people don't, but pleasingly, a lot of people do. And so I think that is opening people's eyes to the value of imagination and of intuition, as well as science and reason, which I find myself championing a lot these days, because they're also under attack from people who don't like science and reason, because it might show the things that they believe to be poorly evidenced. So I think it's that, and I hope, giving people hope, giving them some sense that there is meaning and beauty and purpose there to discover. But you have to have skin in the game. You can't sit there and expect it to go plunk into your lap. You have to make choices, and you have to strive a little for those things. I don't mean necessarily compete, but you need to sort of have a degree of conviction and determination to follow a path. And, following through on something is quite important. It's a thing that I've come to realize rather late in life, that actually following through something, even though it may take you to a viewpoint where you have to change, and it should take you to a viewpoint where you have to change, is rather important. If you stop short when you don't like what's coming next.
Like I say, creativity requires resistance. And
it requires resistance.
And growth, I heard you point out in the previous talk about that fascinating fact that trees that grow inside like a biodome never develop that internal strength because the resistance of wind isn't there.
That's right.
I love that as a metaphor.
Biologists couldn't understand why are all these mature trees protected from every kind of harm? Why are they all falling over before they reach full maturity? And the answer is they had nothing to resist, and trees actually thrive on wind, testing the wood and building the wood. And it's a beautiful metaphor for why life is not supposed to be a walk in the park. It's not supposed to be just a matter of enjoyment. In fact, that would be extremely disappointing. I don't want to do a spoiler for people who haven't read the history of the world in 10.5 chapters, but maybe I will anyway. It's a wonderful, clever book, and at the end of it, there's a story about somebody waking up in a hospital, and a very beautiful nurse is bringing lots of things to eat, and the person said, "Where am I?" And it turns out that he's died, and he is in fact in heaven. And he said, "What am I supposed to do?" "You can do anything you like. If you're a keen golfer, you can have a round of golf with Jack Nicklaus. Whatever it is that you want to do, you can do it." And he sort of thinks about this, and he says, "Do people tend to stay up here?" And she says, "No, usually after about 300 years, they ask to go back." I just thought that was such a brilliant insight, that actually we're not happiest when just everything is given to us. There's something to be said for having to put oneself out to encounter resistance, to overcome resistance, and it helps one grow.
I mean, you put your finger on a very pertinent problem, because technology has made life far too convenient.
Yeah.
There's not enough resistance, and the texture of life feels different if you can breathe through it without ever having to
Yes, I mean, apparently architects have been asked to design shopping centres with steps and things so that people actually do have to exert themselves. And it's healthier than being whisked everywhere in lifts and...
The consequences in your body are not insignificant. Where do you find hope in the best case scenario? When you look at the world and you see things are not going too well, policies are not being made in the interests of the planet or the people in it. But at the same time, you get letters, you give talks, you inspire people to think differently. Where do you find hope, and what are going to be the engines of change?
Well, I think the answer to those two questions come together in that, first of all, although things don't look as though they're getting better, it's a fool who predicts the future. I don't know what's in store, and therefore there is always room for hope. And I think one has a duty in a way to hope, because otherwise we'd all just give up, and then certainly everything would collapse. But there is really grounds for hope in the very people who are going to have to be the agents of change, namely young people. And in just the last couple of months, I gave lectures, public lectures in Oxford and Cambridge, and then in America in 3 or 4 different places. And what I came away with was an overwhelming sense of how good and decent a lot of young people are, and that they can be caricatured as having self-righteous slogans about what must happen. But the people I met were appropriately less arrogant, less know-it-all, delightful, responsive, creative, imaginative, and committed to, trying to understand things and make them better, and not just follow whatever rules were being laid down for them by the current media kind of pundits. So I thought there is a great deal of hope here, and it really was lovely for me. And for them to say that they really resonated with what I was saying, because after all, I'm an old fogey, And so that was very good.
It's an experience, right? Which is the right hemispheres domain. Experience.
Yes. So there we are.
Pull the threads together. As I've asked you, gone all over the place, because there's so much in your thinking that seems to connect to this question of what are cultures preventing us from seeing. And it seems like if you take that characterization of the left hemisphere as utilitarian, understanding values of utility and pleasure, but little else, and that's shaped the way we're attending and the purposes we're finding, to great injury to the way that we're living and to the planet we're living in, and so on. And so to discover the answer to what are cultures preventing us from seeing means listening more keenly to discern what is good and true and beautiful. Would that be one kind of summary of how we attend better to what it is we're not seeing?
Yes, I think the first thing is being aware of what it is one isn't seeing, because unless you have that knowledge, you won't make the effort. So the first thing is to get people to a place where they experience some of the things that would give them a sense of something beyond what it is they so cleverly already know. The business of education is not about confirming the prejudices you come into education with, about shaking your prejudices, and by enabling you to see another point of view. And so I always say that, in education, it should be part of the business to teach people to argue for different points of view. And so, I could make an argument against myself for positions I may have stated in this interview. But I think it's important to not to think that everybody who thinks differently from you must be criminal or stupid, but they may have something there that's worth hearing, and that there may be things that it's worth trying to experience. And I think reconnecting, spending more time in nature, trying to bring yourself to be part of a group of people whose values you respect, and spending some time with them, and if possible, spending time in spiritual practices, which may be conventional or unconventional, but they're better than none. These things are at least orientating us to the idea that what we know is not it all. It's not the whole story. And whatever that whole story is, we will never know it in full. But it is part of the business of life to try and take ourselves on that journey towards a fuller understanding of who we are.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and being so generous with your thoughts.
Thank you very much.